Good morning in Washington, good afternoon in Europe, good afternoon in Kiev, which is also in Europe, as we know. We have a wonderful event to you. My name is John Herbst. I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We're going to talk today with a very, very smart group of people about the reconstruction of Ukraine. And our speakers today are Anders Osland, the Senior Fellow of the Stockholm Free World Forum, and a great colleague of mine here at the Atlantic Council in the past. Professor Richard Green from the Saul Price School of Public Policy at USC in California. We have Vladislav Rashkovan, who's the alternative executive director at the IMF. And we have Ilona Sologub, who's director of political and economic research at the Kiev School of Economics. And they will be presenting a brief report on a book that they have put together, that most of them have put together. And I'll be turning this over to Ilona to go over this, and then we'll have a conversation with our four speakers. Thank you. Ilona, over to you. And congratulations on this wonderful book.
Thank you. So hope you see my presentation. I must give credit to my co-editors, Yuri Gorodnichenko and Beatrice
Ilona, please speak up.
Who had a great contribution to this book as well. And it's never early to talk about the reconstruction, although the war is ongoing. The first blueprint for the reconstruction was published as early as March last year, but this book is an extended and more refined version of it. The purpose of this book was to inform policymakers and public about possible options and principles of reconstruction. It mostly concerns the economic issues. It covers key sectors, which I will talk about later. Each chapter describes pre-war situation, current situation, and possible ways to proceed. And during this book, we made the assumptions that territorial integrity of Ukraine is restored, that Ukraine has some credible security guarantees and is on its path to join the EU, although Russia will remain a threat for some time. And each chapter was written by an international team of authors representing both Ukraine and the Western institutions. And the general structure of the book is as follows. It concerns institutions, the business development, human capital, and infrastructure, although, of course, these chapters overlap. So to the institutional reforms, we can say about EU integration, governance, anti-corruption policies, and organization of aid, which will be presented today by Vladislav. We also talk about business environment, international trade and development of FDI, financial sector and labor market, as well as energy sector, transportation, and the reconstruction of cities, which will be today represented by Professor Green. And also we talk about education, healthcare, and development of science and R&D in Ukraine. Of course, Russian aggression, full-scale aggression, has caused a huge cost on Ukraine. The GDP fell by over 30%. We don't know the exact number and probably will not know, but it's the magnitude of this. Unemployment has tripled, and there are many, of course, refugees and internally displaced people, as well as people who were deported to Russia from the occupied territories. Russia deliberately damages Ukraine's infrastructure, housing, civilian buildings, and so on. And you've probably seen this picture of the dark Ukraine after some of the Russian shelling. So this is the area that was reclaimed by Ukraine since during summer and autumn this year, and in every liberated city or village, we find mass graves, we find places where people were tortured and executed. So Ukrainians have no choice but to fight to liberate all of their land and all of their people. Of course, it will not be easy, and we hope very much on the support of our allies. But it's also never early to talk about the reconstruction, and that's why we composed this book to discuss Ukraine's future. The main goals of the reconstruction, we consider that Ukraine becomes a full-fledged democracy with a modern economy with strong institutions that are needed also for the powerful defense sector, but for the well-being of people naturally as well. And full membership of EU and NATO is also on the agenda. The principles of reconstruction are as follows. This should be one process with the EU integration. So Ukraine's part to the EU and its reconstruction should be one process. Building back better principle so that Ukraine does not rebuild what was damaged, but rather rebuilds modernized infrastructure, modernized production facilities, and so on. Ukraine owns the reconstruction so that it has some skin in the game, so that it is Ukrainian government and businesses are interested and involved into the reconstruction. And in this respect, it's good to build on the decentralization reform to involve local government, communities, people, and this will also help democratic development of Ukraine. It should be rapid but conditional, and I'm glad to say that the EU is already employing this principle, and thus 15 billion of the promised 18 billion aid that will be provided for 2023 is conditional on Ukraine implementing the reforms, which are key for its development. It's important not to overburden Ukraine with debt, so we argue that aid should be grants rather than loans, and we see that in 2022 it was slightly tilted towards loans, whereas hopefully this year we will receive more grants. And of course, economic cost is enormous. The Ukraine's budget deficit last year was about 20% of GDP and expected to reach the same amount in 2023, whereas in previously it was like 2-3% in the previous few years. It's important that donors coordinate rather than compete with each other, and that the administration of the reconstruction is performed via a single agency that has clear responsibilities, that has vertical structure, and it is clear who is responsible for what and who makes decisions. This is just the repeating of these 6 principles that we promote in the book. And main takeaways are that, first of all, of course, Ukraine has to win the war, and to win it quicker and to have less damage, it needs weapons, and it also needs rebuilding. During the war, what can be rebuilt, for example, repairing power plants or power grids, power infrastructure. Also, nothing prevents Ukraine from implementing institutional reforms like the judicial reforms that is ongoing. There will be the need for the new infrastructure for provision of aid, both for fundraising and for distribution of aid. This will be this new agency accompanied by some probably new multi-donor fund facility. Of course, public funds will not be enough. There should be private investment and probably some investor guarantee agency, some insurance against war risk, but also institutional reforms in Ukraine are the necessary condition for attraction of private investment. Some infrastructure projects will be very costly, such as changing the gauge of the railroad to the European one. And some objects, some cities will not, unfortunately, be rebuilt, and some will be reinvented into the smaller size. There will be also a reallocation of resources, so Ukraine needs massive retraining program and program for integration of workers, of refugees who will hopefully come back, of veterans, and so a huge social movement and social integration will be on the way. And this requires, of course, investment into human capital, development of education, provision of some training for adults, education for adults, and so on. But Ukraine can also offer a lot to the youth. It will not only take, but also offer such things, for example, like low carbon energy. And its IT sector is quite well developed, and it also provides some solutions to other countries. And it can be a member of or a chain, enter the value chains. So to conclude, Ukraine needs help of the allies, all the help it can get. But the international community, I think, is also interested in Ukraine's victory and reconstruction, because I remember Ambassador Herbst, as you said once in Kiev, that it's not Russia against Ukraine, it's reaction against the future. So now we are fighting, I think, for the future. So I'll stop here.
Ilona, thank you very much for that excellent presentation. And now we'll start with our moderated conversation, and that will be followed by audience Q&A. All right, so Ilona, the first question is for you. Before Ukraine can actually implement this plan for reconstruction and transformation, it must win the war. And that required, as you point out, substantial economic assistance to sustain minimal government and societal expenses. Your chart showed a Ukrainian need for, I think, 38 billion for 2023. How do you justify this to Western governments and publics?
This 38 billion calculation was from Ukrainian government, who calculated that they have about $4 to $5 billion deficit per month. This is from comparing what they can collect in taxes or other revenues to what are the expenses, because as you see, their production is very much damaged and unemployment is high. So both households need some support, and also Ukraine needs to finance the army, and it finances the army only with own revenues. So pretty much whole amount of own Ukrainian revenues goes to the war, to the army.
I guess in a sense, you could say that given the huge hit your economy has taken, if we want to make sure Ukraine wins the war, we have to also provide economic as well as military support. Okay, one more quick question. The Marshall Plan cost the United States $13 billion in the late 1940s. This translates into approximately $150 billion today. What is the anticipated cost of the reconstruction of Ukraine under your plan?
It's hard to say right now because the war isn't going and damage is done every day. There were some estimates by the World Bank in June last year that amounted to $350 billion, but there were some other estimates like more than $1 trillion. We will see how it goes. Of course, not everything will be rebuilt as it was. This was a damage assessment. Perhaps reconstruction cost will be somewhere in between those numbers. It may be higher. Of course, Ukraine will also contribute to the reconstruction significantly. So we don't think that this all should be Western money, so to say. And of course, we should not forget about Russian assets that can be compensated and provided to Ukraine.
Okay, thank you very much. Anders, you were involved in the transformation of Eastern European economies in the 1990s, and that was a spectacular success. Of course, those states were not also recovering from a savage war of aggression. What is your assessment of the Reconstruction Transformation Plan presented by Dr. Sologub?
Thank you very much, John, and thank you for the invitation to this event, and my congratulations to the editor and the authors of this very impressive report. The short answer is that this report very much represents the mainstream of the thinking of what happened in the East European transformation. I very much appreciate in the introduction, it's very clearly stated that this should not be sheer reconstruction, it should be transformation rather than reconstruction. And the report very well combines the three central elements: EU accession, which was really a basis of the success of the Central European countries, reform, and also reconstruction. So that there are three clear aims, and they are very well put together. As Ilona presented, I would put it slightly differently. First, you have economic system, then we have sectors, and then social issues, and at the end, a discussion of how the funding should be organized. So, which makes perfect sense. What is not here is macroeconomics, because there Ukraine essentially has done the job, and therefore it doesn't need to be discussed now. What I see as a shortcoming is very much what was a shortcoming in the reforms in Central Europe, not in the Baltic states, and that's rule of law. There are 3 pages devoted to rule of law, and this is the key problem. And this is a natural consequence that both in Central Europe and in this report, essentially all of the authors are economists. What is very good is that each chapter is written by Westerners and by Ukrainians, so that the Ukrainian aspect is fully covered everywhere. But the historical outlook could be more by necessity. Although this is a very big report, it is pretty general. It is a very easy and nice read. So one can quickly read the report in spite of it being 467 pages all together. But rule of law needs to be developed. And here, of course, one needs to look upon the concrete experiences. So it's talked about that one needs to have Western international experts, but the big problem is the Constitutional Court, and another is the High Council of Justice, and these are the top organs. And here we are seeing the judges sitting and blocking everything and fighting for corruption. So this is a matter not of providing advice, but ousting them. The EU has very clearly stated these 2 reforms as a key. And I think that it would be very useful if CPR in its future work invites top lawyers in these areas. And that concerns also other matters. Another issue is democracy, which was badly neglected also in Central Europe. I think here that Gerard Roland and Timothy Milovanov do a good job in their chapter, that they do cover the essential elements of democracy, but this also needs to be elaborated. So I think that they are doing it very well. What I very much appreciate, as I already mentioned, that the EU accession as a central element in this report. And when it comes to the concrete reforms, the report is very much standard, a general view, the best practice that has been received. The literature is recognized, and the Ukrainian reality is recognized. What one would want is, of course, more details in each area. It's more general on principles than concrete on specific measures that should be undertaken. But that's, of course, what needs to be done in the future. I should also say that this follows very naturally on the excellent CPR report from April, which I see as a basis of it all, and that has been well received by everybody who deals with the Ukrainian reconstruction issues now. Thank you.
Anders, thank you for that comprehensive assessment. All right, Dr. Green, you are an expert in real estate economics. Non-transparent government control over land in Ukraine has been a persistent source of corruption. How does this plan address that?
So thank you for having me here today. And I will start by just following up on what Anders just said. And rule of law is key here, and particularly having a titling system where things are well established and there are no disputes with property transferred is an important underpinning of this. And I know that's a very difficult thing to do, but it's an essential thing to do. But the other thing, we see an opportunity here in that much of Ukraine has had a housing type that doesn't make a lot of sense given the population density of the country. And I find it strange that I'm advocating for this, because here in Los Angeles, I think we have too many single-family houses and we need more multifamily housing. But in Ukraine, particularly outside of Kiev, it's the opposite. If you look at Ukraine relative to Europe, more people live in multifamily houses, Soviet-style blocks, of course. That is the case in Europe more generally, despite the fact that Ukraine is one of the least dense countries in Europe. At the same time, as Ilona noted in our comments, there are cities in Ukraine that are inevitably going to be smaller already, or even before the war were smaller than they were at their peak, will probably continue to be smaller. And that means they need to think about how are they healthy, vibrant cities with smaller populations that they were at peak. And there are examples of this in the West, Manchester in the UK, Pittsburgh in the US. And so our view is that a mechanism for bringing this about is, instead of having government rebuild housing for people, which we are very skeptical about, is somehow you assign vouchers to people based on the value of what they lost as a result of the conflict. And then they use those vouchers in order to go out and build for themselves less complicated housing, single-family houses or duplexes, or maybe houses as big as 4 units, but not the sort of massive blocks of flats that we are used to when we think about cities in the former Soviet Union. And because they're less complicated, the development process would be more transparent, and it would be more difficult for contractors to take advantage of people. Now, the other thing, and this is another layer of complication, that would be ambitious, but also developing a system of housing and construction finance that's a genuinely market-based system. Because one of the successful ways that people monitor new construction, if they're building a home for themselves, is they get a construction loan from a bank. The bank has an interest in making sure that money is not paid out for construction until it's actually used for construction. So people can't take money and run away with it. So there'll be invoices for contractors who've actually done things before the money is distributed. So it's a combination of things, but putting power in the hands of those who are rebuilding, which is those who are going back to live where things were destroyed, having a system of clean titling, and having a finance system, a construction finance system that acts as a mechanism for monitoring contractors, we think would all be helpful in terms of ameliorating what has been a corrupt sector in Ukraine. And Ambassador, you're on mute.
Thank you. Okay, I've done that before. All right, Vlad. This effort will be informed and aided by the fact that the EU is offering Ukraine a path to membership. That provides substantial incentive for Ukraine to do the difficult reform work. The report says, quote, aid should be administered by a self-standing EU-affiliated or authorized agency, independent of but accountable to multilateral, bilateral, and non-governmental donors. That's quite a mouthful. Please describe how you think this would work.
Thanks, Ambassador. It's a good question, and in our chapter with Barry Eichengring, we speak more really on how to organize aid rather than focus on some specific industry or sector. And we say about the necessity to build a designated architecture for the post-war Ukrainian reconstruction, and we need it, because the reconstruction and modernization of the country will require the, as we say, Herculean efforts, probably over a decade, maybe even more, and which means also the several political cycles, which will hopefully, and we believe in that, will bring our country under the roof of the European Union family. And analyzing the different experiences in our chapter, both post-conflict and post-natural disasters, we may say that such an architecture should consist of many interconnected pieces, and Ilona was already speaking about clear understanding of the prerequisites and principles of reconstruction. We also need the vision and strategy, which is endorsed by the country leadership, but also the majority of the active population. We need to have mechanisms for coordination of donors, but also for oversight. And we need to develop financial vehicles and instruments to finance reconstruction. And finally, the implementation mechanisms. And I should mention that the several elements of this architecture are being built as we speak now. Just let me give you few recent news highlights. First, U.S. government appointed inspector generals for the oversight of the U.S. support, and Department of Defense, State, and USAID inspectorate issued a joint report like last week. And it's worth to be read as well. It's an interesting document. And I'm sure that these structures will be working further, together with 17 other US organizations which compose so-named the Ukraine Oversight Interagency Working Group. Second, the US supplementary budget, which has been recently signed by the President Biden, includes the first money designated specifically for the reconstruction. You may not see it as a separate line, but since I know the process behind, I know the money is there. And by end of the February, we wait also for the new damage assessment report from the World Bank. And the work is ongoing now, and probably we may expect that the reconstruction cost will double, the amount which announced last summer. At that time it was around 350 billion, and we mentioned this in the report, but now it may be, 600, 700 billion. We don't know the amount yet. At the same time, in Ukraine, the coalition of the civil society NGOs, RISE, the name is RISE, is developing a pilot on the digital accountability mechanism, which would cover, different stages of reconstruction, from damage assessment, to public oversight and audit. And these are very capable guys, and who were developing Prozoro system in the past. And last month, later in this month, there will be the first meeting of the Economic Rammstein Group, or as it named now, like a multi-agency donor coordination platform for Ukraine. And this is an important milestone, and because European Union, US, Ukraine will be a leader, G7 plus countries and several major financial institutions, international financial institutions, including IMF, will participate in the coordination. And one of the focuses of the platform will be reconstruction. And since the end game for Ukraine, as you said, and as we know, as Ilona is saying, is a membership of EU, there will be a dedicated function for Brussels as well. And finally, we have a new vice prime minister in Ukraine responsible for reconstruction, Alexander Kubrakov, who is also assigned to establish a reconstruction agency, the agency which we are speaking in our report. And this will be the government institution. It will be not EU-led institution, but it will be government institution which will tackle the reconstruction. And the chapter we analyze the experience of the similar agencies abroad, like in Pakistan agency ERA, or CNO in Sri Lanka. There is also after tsunami in Indonesia, there was also created BRR agency. And as far as I know, the Ukrainian government analyzes these experiences as well, like also reading our chapter in our book. And we believe that this agency should be less dependent on the cabinet, and therefore it will help to go smoothly for the political cycles. At the same time, the government should design the priorities for reconstruction, which should work, which the agency should work. The leadership of this agency should be selected on a competitive base with experience working with a European Commission, because this will be very much important further, but also other donors. The agency should have a possibility to hire specialists from other G7 plus countries, therefore not to be binded with more only Ukrainians, but clearly Ukrainians should be the major part of this group, and also the agency should be able to pay them, the market remuneration. We may speak about supervisory board. We say about that in the report, but also the staff responsible for the operations of this agency, should be based as much as closer to the reconstruction areas. Therefore, not to be super centralized in Kiev. And clearly, the reconstruction, budget should be audited both through oversight from public, but also by audit. So in a nutshell, merging these elements together, which is the agency, the coordination platform, the financing vehicles, and oversight accountability mechanism. I think if we merge them together and we will build on that, now, there is a good chance to build a sustainable and capable architecture for Ukrainian post-war reconstruction, both with a strong Ukrainian ownership, as Ilona was saying, as a principle, but also transparent and oversight from the donors and creditors, including from European Union. Thanks. You're on mute, man.
Thank you, Vlad. Ilona, it's essential that this reconstruction transformation plan be fully supported by Ukraine's leadership. Has your book been put together in cooperation with the President and the Prime Minister's office? And what role will the Ukrainian government play in connection with the EU-affiliated or authorized independent agency that you suggest oversee this process?
As Vladislav said, the Ukrainian government takes ownership of this and establishes this agency. I think they will cooperate with the EU. There is no way actually to proceed to the EU implement this acquis and other conditions without close cooperation with the EU. As for the writing, during writing of this book, we did not have the contribution of the Ukrainian government in order for it to have independent views and not to depend on anything. But certainly, Ukrainian government has seen it and has considered some of the ideas. Mute.
Thank you. Anders, this project will be expensive. The report urges that the funds for this program be grants rather than loans. How do you think that the Western and other donor countries and institutions should finance this? Should they follow Canada's lead in using frozen Russian state funds for this purpose?
John, there's one thing that is important about this, that is that the Central Bank of Russia currency reserves should be confiscated. That is slightly more than $300 billion. As far as we know, it's frozen among 7 Western central banks: US, New York Fed, Canada, the UK, France, Germany, Austria, Japan, and the UK. None of these central banks has even confirmed that they have the money, and they have not confirmed how much they have. And they are clearly fighting tooth and nail against confiscation because they think that it's bad for their reputation. This is disastrous. This is the only solid source of funding that is available. And this can be taken by the Western countries. Of course, it would require in each of these 7 countries legislation. Canada, as you mentioned, has taken such legislation. As far as I know, they have not implemented it for the central bank reserves. They've taken some oligarch assets. Oligarch assets, as far as it has been publicized, is about $60 billion that has been frozen. Most of the money is anonymous, and typical Russian really dirty money has 20, 30 layers of shell companies on top of one another. And it's pretty impossible to seize. What governments have managed to freeze, it's mainly real estate and yachts. If you try to sell them on an executive auction, you normally get about half the face value. And then you get lots of law cases, and all these oligarchs say that they are not guilty. They haven't done anything for the Russian government. So to go after the oligarchic money is quite impossible. And in the US, the latest defense bill does include a law on the confiscation of oligarch money. And I'm not aware of how that is being implemented. The senators who pushed this were particularly Sheldon Whitehouse on the Democratic side and James Risch on the Republican side. But they focused on the oligarch money because that is popular, rather than going after the central bank currency reserves that is serious. I should say comment on in particular what Vlad said, that I very much appreciate in this report, as Vlad now showed, that there is a clear idea of what kind of a government agency or agency that should be established, as it's called, Ukraine Reconstruction and European Integration Agency, a self-standing EU-affiliated agency in cooperation with the Ukrainian government. And also what Vlad emphasized, that the Ukrainian government needs to establish something that is quite independent, as is now being done. The question that arises, and here the German Marshall Fund took quite a different view. They want something that is led by the G7, which is not a formal structure, the formal agency. I think that is a wrong approach, because we hope that there will be a lot of money involved. And the question is how the other G7 countries, the US, Canada, the UK, and Japan, it can be fully integrated. And the report does not fully address that question, which the German Marshall Fund stressed quite strongly. I prefer the CPR approach, but this is a question that needs to be sorted out. And the most important thing is that it really comes to a conclusion. And I thought that it was very positive that the G7 in December made a clear statement that we are going to appoint representatives from each of our government to deal with this matter. So I hope that they will really come to the conclusion. It's more important that there is a conclusion than exactly what kind of system that is organized. Vlad and Barry, I can go through the different sources of financing that are possible, but as they emphasize, most of this is loans, and it has to be from the governments if it's not war reparations from Russia, and it's only the central bank reserves that it can be substantial. So therefore, I would suggest that we all push however much we can for the confiscation of the central bank reserves of Russia that have been frozen. Thank you.
Anders, just a quick point. My understanding is that the G7 has been slow to convene that group, and it's going to be a relatively low level. So I think they need some help encouraging them to do the right thing. Okay, Richard, Dr. Green, the report notes that while funding will be essential for the success of this plan, FDI will also be critical. What must Ukraine do? What should the international community do to encourage FDI in Ukraine?
See, now I did that. A couple of things. First of all, again, to hit on the point of rule of law, there has to be confidence in property rights. And there is precedent here, which is the case of South Korea, which in some ways is more similar to what's happening in Ukraine than what happened to the countries that were rebuilt after World War II. In the sense that Japan and Germany and the UK and France were relatively rich countries before World War II. Ukraine was not a rich country even before the invasion of Crimea. And South Korea was not a rich country before 1950. And what happened in South Korea is there really was a transformation in governance. So in the 50s, it was amongst the most corrupt countries in the world. It's now, if you look at Transparency International, but for one measure, it's sort of in the same category as the US when it comes to corruption, which is to say it's not the best, but it's pretty good. And if you look at South Korea, the amount of foreign direct investment there in the form of people owning equities in its stock market, it's in the neighborhood of half. So clearly it's seen as a hospitable place to invest. And so thinking about making that transformation so that there is confidence about property rights and the rule of law is critical to encouraging FDI. The other thing, of course, is macroeconomic stability. And one way to think about this is it's really hard to get people to invest in a country if interest rates are more than 10%, if government bond rates are more than 10%, because it's going to be hard to make a private sector investment look good relative to that. And there's generally a reflection of perceived risk of the country, but also, of course, underlying inflation. And so making sure macroeconomic policy is not overly inflationary, which is a very difficult thing to do under this environment, will be critical to getting FDI, particularly in terms of the debt side. So from a consumer standpoint, when interest rates go above a certain level, borrowing becomes unattractive, even in a world of inflation where real rates may not be that high. You have this phenomenon of tilt, where debt service payments are just very high as a share of current income, and therefore not sustainable in the short run. And so, again, having macroeconomic policy, keeping inflation sufficiently low, which is difficult to do given that the other, of course, aim is going to be to encourage employment and reconstruction, so that interest rates stay relatively low, I think is going to be key to FDI in the years to come.
Thank you. Okay, Vlad, my last question is for you. The plan talks about using decentralized authorities to help inform and implement it. How do you see this taking place?
Yeah, if I may just very briefly respond to three small items. First is on Anders' comment on G7 role. As I said, the donor coordination platform, which we've actually the G7 platform for supporting Ukraine, also on reconstruction. Ambassador, on your comment on comparatively low level of the representation there, you are, as of today, you're right, and we're working to increase this level. So one of the ideas is to ensure that at least the meeting of ministers will happen during the spring meetings, and later we need to bring even higher political level on this platform. But the fact that the platform, will be functioning is already a good step forward. And the last thing is, I think Anders was mentioning about the role of confiscation. Just for your information, the government in their proposal for the coordination platform was offering that this issue should be also one of the topics for the discussion. And factually, it was turned down because there are other task force in the world about the confiscation. There was an idea not to overlap, but I fully agree with you that the confiscation is, since it's one of the potential major, sources for the reconstruction or reparation from Russia, this should be clearly coordinated. Coming back to your question, Ambassador, I believe that the questions all the questions of reconstruction are not easy, but combining the decentralized DNA of Ukraine with the centralized reconstruction will be one of the major and larger challenges. What we see now, the thoughts and strategizing on post-war reconstruction is clearly decentralized. It's in business, in civil society, among donors, among think tanks, intellectuals, and clearly government, different parts of the government. At the same time, the government is really, and we already discussed it, is building this implementation process on a centralized base. And and it relates also to donors. Actually, the central government built a very comprehensive and successful system of cooperation and working with donors. In 2022, it was mostly about the budgetary support. Ilona was mentioning the figures, but in 2023, as I said, it will be also focusing on reconstruction, but also on energy security and business support, but on the central level. And we understand that there are many nationwide projects which will require state central coordination, like airports, like new EU standards, railways, building military and security facilities, and clearly the central nationwide roads. And this is and the role here of the central central agency is well justified. But from the World Bank damage assessment says that the majority of reconstruction will be decentralized, in the cities and local communities. And we speak about housing, we speak about schools, hospitals, cultural objects, sports objects, local roads, and the responsibility, and also according to Ukrainian legislation, for these investments and costs are on the local budget shoulders, local mayors, local communities. So I believe we need to create a capacity also on the local level, otherwise the reconstruction will kill another successful reform, which is decentralization, and this was a reform of the last decade. So I believe while creating a central implementation agency, we don't need to forget the regional governments and the communities, and they should have also their own access to donors as well. And I hope it will be one of the topics for the coordination platform. And the last, we also need to work on building capacity, in those regions, because we will need, thousands of project managers, the financial managers, who will be able to speak with donors and coordinate the reconstruction. And I hope that Ilona, KSE will be also among those institutions which will help with that. And I hope also USAID and EU will be able to finance it. Thanks.
Vlad, thank you. Okay, we have a bunch of audience questions. I'll start with one from Thaisa Marcus. The questioner asked, private sector investment will play a role in reconstruction. Is there any discussion in Ukraine on ensuring that FDI laws thread the needle between encouraging investment on the one hand and avoiding key sectors or businesses from being sold, controlled to foreigners? Ilona, thoughts on this?
I haven't seen the discussion about being sold to foreigners. Rather, there is a discussion that the privatization should proceed, and it should be done in a transparent way so that anyone who is able and who is willing can participate, and people understand why this entity bought some enterprise and not the other entity. So the main thing that that it's transparent and done under clear rules rather than some undercover deals.
Thank you. Okay, Richard, you want to jump in on this too?
Again, to some extent, so I think if the questioner is asking about, do we want to see reconstruction happen the way it happened in Afghanistan and Iran, the answer to that is no. Having local ownership and local control, again, and that's the hands of individuals as part of reconstruction, I think is critical. But that said, we do want FDI, and one of the ways that could happen, again, in the right environment, is through lending channels. And we know how capital markets can be used to finance housing in particular. In the US, we use capital markets and we get lots of foreign investment in Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Ginnie Mae securities as a way to fund our housing. So I guess the way to start is if it happens on the debt side, and so long as the debt terms are reasonable, that's a way you get FDI into at least the housing reconstruction sector without foreign ownership in that sector, or limited foreign ownership in that sector.
Ambassador, can I add if possible? Can I add 1 second?
Please.
I believe this is the good question, because while the Russian reparations could be a big part of the reconstruction, the modernization should be done by the private sector and not solely by the public money. And therefore, I believe the private, and one element of modernization is also bringing Ukraine closer to the European or global value chains to be incorporated there. And therefore, I'm clearly not, afraid of bringing FDIs in Ukraine. But it means that while the government is working with donors and creditors on designing the channels of supplying money to Ukraine, also the private business also to probably should create their own channels, to come to Ukraine, and their own probably even infrastructure for doing that. I would not rely solely here on the government channels. Thanks.
Okay, Anders, you want to jump in too?
Yes, indeed. What Ilona talked about, transparency is vital in order to avoid Russian investment. Russian investment is prohibited and must be so for obvious security reasons. And it's really enough to have transparency so that we can see that there are no Russian interests behind it. I don't think that we should believe much in early foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment does not come when there are massive political risks. There are ways of handling these risks. One is political risk insurance, which bilateral credit agencies and the World Bank MIGA can handle. And development finance cooperation on the US side is quite important to come in. But I cringe when I see the Ukrainian government trying to do investment drives now. Foreign investment is not easily attracted to a war zone.
Okay, Anders, thank you. I'm going to pull a question from among the later questions because I think it has a broader meaning. It's from Patrick Harvey. He says, I am not a Ukraine expert, have great understanding of reconstruction and its pitfalls, particularly modern efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan, which faced huge corruption issues that were fueled by dueling factions within the governments and portions of the population that felt cheated and disenfranchised. There was little accountability. Can you share your sense of what corruption challenges a post-war Ukraine reconstruction transformation effort will face? Angela, I'll give that to you first, and others can feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I think that both Richard and Vlad have really responded to this, that it should be done in a decentralized fashion. We don't want to turn to the central government if we can avoid it. A reason why we have seen very little of corruption during the war in Ukraine is partly because the military has been thoroughly reformed and is not considered particularly corrupt any longer, or even very clean. And the other is the decentralization. You all the time see popularly elected mayors speaking good English and appearing on television. So the reconstruction, as I think Richard explained, should take place as insurance money given as vouchers, so that people who have lost property should get simply insurance coverage for what they have lost, of course, reasonably assessed, and then they decide what they do with this money. Then you avoid going through the central government, and you avoid the problems that were so typical of Iraq and Afghanistan, where everything went through central government.
Okay, thank you. Vlad, you want to jump in on this or no?
Yeah, I may. There are two elements. Answering this question. The first, I would definitely don't underestimate the role of Ukrainian civil society. I mentioned already this coalition of RISE. This is a coalition of 40 plus NGOs, which were many of them were involved in the anti-corruption, in the surveillance of different policies, in democracy topics, but also in ProZorro system building or ProZorro sales system building. And this is, as we know, they're very successful. So they are, and we analyze, I'm dealing with them pretty often, but we analyzed a lot different experiences, different books, reading about the like building digital systems on controlling the reconstruction to make it transparent process. And I should be very frank, what they're building now is by far advanced than we see in the different books, because the major things have been done like 10, 15 years ago, and therefore they're technologically and outdated. So first. Second is answering the question, what risks I'm afraid of. I would say that is a risk of supply corruption, because, there will be many different players abroad who will want to play their role in the reconstruction, and therefore in some sectors maybe monopolizing or trying to agree with their own governments. So we need to avoid that as well, and the supply side corruption should be analyzed like also the potential Ukrainian corruption. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. We have a rather detailed question from Alexandra Koidel, and forgive me if I mispronounce that name. The question is this: do you consider current tax and administration system in Ukraine, in parentheses, the very concept of a tax invoice, so podatkova nakladna, the fact of paying taxes before an entrepreneur receives revenues, transfer pricing, the ability of tax administration to block tax invoice and thus block the work of a company? Do you consider this concept of tax invoices as conducive for the transformation of Ukraine, or do you see a need for change? Vlad, you want to give that a shot?
Yeah, maybe let first Ilona to answer.
Okay.
Okay. I think the problem is not that much in the tax system itself. All the business surveys show that the problem is with tax administration. Tax service, it's still not reformed, and on many occasions it is corrupt. So among the task of building institutions for Ukraine, reforming the tax inspection or tax administration is one of the key tasks. As for the particular questions on tax invoices, I think that a person referred to VAT payment, and that system has been considerably improved in the latest years. So it was made electronic and so on. So problem remain, but they need to be addressed, and we know if it could be put in the electronic formats, then the remaining problem can be solved as well.
Ambassador, if I may jump in, it's a very I would say that the reform of the tax system in Ukraine should be one of the key reforms in the next years, but it does not necessarily mean just decreasing taxes. It's not about that. It's very interesting to see how many Ukrainians and businesses donate money, and collect, hundreds of millions of hryvnias per day. Being able to consolidate because they give this money to the people who they trust. Like some donate, the charity organizations, the military, also on civil society, on the, etc. And it means that there is built trust with these people, and people are ready to take part of their revenue and give that. I think the major thing of the last 30 years that many Ukrainians didn't build a trust with the government system on taxation specifically. And therefore, building this trust is an important element of the reform in the future. But again, reform does not necessarily mean that just decreasing taxes.
Thank you. Okay, we have 1 minute left, and we've got a factual question, which I think would be of use for our audience. It's from Jan Tombinsky. The question is this: does an inventory, even approximate, of Ukrainian national resources on and under the surface exist? If so, to be used to attract potential investors and to understand the needs to shape proper regulatory basis for future exploitation. Ilona, can you take that?
Yes, there are some estimates of Ukrainian natural resources, and they are cited in the energy chapter on the book. I don't remember the numbers, but there are estimates of gas deposits and some others. So yeah, you can find that. And recently, there was the new law that simplified obtaining the permits for exploration of natural resources.
Okay, thank you very much. We also had a request, are the slides that you presented available to the audience in some fashion?
They're already there.
Already there.
Yeah.
Okay, well, hopefully the audience can see them and pull them down. If not, you can connect with the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council and we'll help you find them. I'd like to thank all of our guests today for a very fine presentation on a difficult subject that's going to be with us for years to come. The Eurasia Center at the Council, the Atlantic Council, will be doing more work on the subject. We look forward to seeing you then.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of you.